When the Romans invaded Italy, they found a land settled by warring Celtic tribes. One of the most powerful were the Brigantes, who dominated the land between the rivers Tweed and Trent. But, plagued by intertribal disputes, the Celts were vulnerable. Brigantia was torn by a civil war between King Venutius and his wife Queen Cartimandua. The Romans assisted the queen and restored her to power. However, around 71 AD, Venutius struck back. As a countermeasure, over 6,000 soldiers of the 9th Legion marched north from their Lincoln base to invade the tribal land of the Brigantes. To fight this campaign, their commander, Quintus Petilus Cerealis, established a military base on a naturally defensive site, standing in marshland next to the navigable river Ouse. He named it Eboracum. In 108 AD, Cerealis' original wooden fortress was replaced by a stone fortification that occupied a 50-acre site and housed over 5,000 men, soldiers that needed barracks, stables, offices, and shops. Soon, a thriving commercial life grew under the protection of the Roman fortress. A town was born. The Emperor Severus strengthened the town's defenses and, for 2 years, ruled the Roman Empire from York. His son Caracalla promoted the town to the status of a colonia, the highest legal status for a town within the Roman Empire. When the Emperor Constantius Chlorys died in 306 AD, the legionaries based at Eboracum proclaimed his son as the new emperor. The story of Constantine the Great began in York. As the Roman Empire decayed, beset by dynastic struggles and civil wars, Roman troops were steadily withdrawn, and the defense of the city began to rest on local auxiliaries and on European troops drafted in. These mercenaries from Germany and the Baltic coast heralded a new wave of invaders, the Anglo-Saxons. Whether Eboracum itself suffered at the hands of the new invaders is hard to say. However, there is no doubt that the city declined and fell into decay. Traces of Roman York can still be found in today's city. Stonegate and Petergate run on the line of original Roman foundations. Beneath the Minster, remains of the great Roman fortress can be seen. A Roman column, once part of the headquarters building, still survives. Discovered beneath York Minster, it stands 30 feet tall and has been re-erected opposite the south door of the Minster. In the basement of the Roman Bath Inn, St. Sampson's Square, are the preserved remains of a Roman bathhouse. Once hidden away, they are now on display for the visiting public. Roman walls can still be seen. And in the gardens of the Yorkshire Museum stands the Multangular Tower. It is one of the finest surviving examples of Roman masonry in Britain, and originally formed the western corner of the fortress. Here, tombs dug from the earth have their final resting place. Traces of a vanished civilization that survived in York for over 340 years.
York became home to people employed by the Romans as mercenaries, who settled, and, after the Roman withdrawal around 410 AD, took control of the city, renaming it Eoforwic. At first, the new settlers didn't move into the abandoned Roman city, choosing instead to build timber settlements some distance away, though eventually they did build over the Roman foundations. In the gardens of the Yorkshire Museum can be found impressive evidence of this, the unique Anglian Tower. This building dates from a period between the 6th and 7th century and is the bottom story of a tower built to breach a hole in the original Roman wall. Excavated in 1969, it's the only one of its type to be found in the country. The warring smaller kingdoms of Northumbria were eventually united by Ethelfrith of Bernicia, whose successor, Edwin, established a royal residence at Eoforwick. On the 12th of April, 627 AD, Edwin was baptized in a small wooden church at Eoforwick. That church was the forerunner of today's York Minster. St. Cuthbert, Bishop of Lindisfarne, is said to have blessed the city, and St. Cuthbert's church is dedicated to his memory. Although the present building dates from 1430, a church has stood on this site since 687 AD, 2 years after the saint's death. Also dating back to this period, the Church of St. Mary's, Bishop Hill Jr. has a tower that retains typical Saxon windows and herringbone masonry. Under the guidance of the monks from Lindisfarne, Northumbria became renowned throughout Europe as a centre of learning and art. A spectacular example of their craftsmanship can be found at York's Castle Museum, the York helmet. Made of iron and decorated with brass, the helmet carries an inscription in the form of a Christian prayer and represents one of the most important archaeological finds this century. The winds of the Northumbrian Renaissance were blowing. In 735 AD, Egbert, the first Archbishop of York, founded a school and library that became famous throughout the Christian world. A pupil and later master of this school was Alcuin, a learned man who in time became master of the palace school of the Emperor Charlemagne. He described York as
high-walled and towered, a merchant town of land and sea, a haven for the ships from distant ports, watered by the fishery tools, a lovely dwelling place whose health and richness will fill it full of men.
His description of York is still applicable today. The last century of Eoforwick was marred by dynastic disputes, political instability, and consequent economic decline. The town seemed to lapse back into a dark age. On the horizons of the North Sea, storm clouds were appearing. The sails of a new invader could already be seen.
In 866 AD, the storm cloud burst. A large army of Viking warriors landed on the coast of East Anglia and marched north, seizing York. The main body of this Viking army travelled south to fight King Alfred, but a Viking named Halfdan led part of the army back to York and established a Viking kingdom with Jorvik as its capital. This kingdom survived for approximately 80 years, when its last king, the Norwegian Erik Bloodaxe, was chased out of Jorvik by the English king Edred in 965 AD. However, in the intervening years, the Northumbrian and Viking people had intermixed to such a degree that the Viking character of the town remained until the Norman conquest. Evidence of this influence can still be found in various street names. Gudrum Gate in Guthrum Street, Boosgate, Spurrier Gate, and Coppergate, where in 1975 the world-famous Coppergate dig began. Over a 5-year period, archaeologists uncovered the remains of Viking York, revealing the houses and workshops of Jorvik. Built on the site of this dig as an integral part of the Coppergate Centre, the Jorvik Viking Centre is a unique museum which incorporates original timbers and artifacts within a reconstruction of a Viking street. In 1042, Anglo-Saxon rule returned to England with the ascent to the throne of Edward the Confessor. The scene was now set for the dramatic events that followed. The year 1066 will echo forever in the history of the British people.
Viking York came to a bloody end. In 1066, Edward the Confessor died and was succeeded by Harold. Tosti, the Earl of Northumbria, driven out by his own people, joined forces with the King of Norway, Harald Hardrada, and in September 1066, their invasion force took York after a bitter fight at Fulford. King Harold reacted swiftly. He marched north, and on the 25th of September, surprised the invaders at Stamford Bridge, where his English army routed the Viking horde, killing both Tosti and the Norwegian king. But Harold had no time to celebrate his victory. Hardly had he returned from the battlefield when news reached York of a second invasion, led by William, Duke of Normandy. Harold immediately marched south to face defeat and death 19 days later on the battlefield at Hastings. From the 15th of October 1066 onwards, the English people had new masters, the Normans. 2 years after his victory, William faced a revolt in Northumbria led by Earl Cospatrick. He led his army north and entered York unchallenged, the leaders of the revolt having fled to Scotland. To fortify the town, William built a wooden castle on a strategic site on the west bank of the River Ouse. Its original earthen mound, known as Bailey Hill, still stands. Northumbria revolted against Norman rule once again in 1068, when a rebel army laid siege to the castle. The Normans fought back, and their forces retook York, plundering the city and its churches. To maintain his hold on this important northern city, William built a second fortification. The 13th century Clifford's Tower stands on the original earthen mound. Later that same year, a Danish army invaded Northumbria. Led by the Danish King Sweyn, it sailed up the Humber, joined forces with the Northumbrian rebels, and stormed York, killing the Norman garrison. The town was no longer defensible, and as William and his army once again moved north, the Danes abandoned the city. William harassed the invaders, allowing them no time to settle and fortify elsewhere, a tactic that soon forced them to make terms. The Danish army sailed home, and William turned his anger and fury towards Yorkshire, setting out on a punitive campaign that laid waste to the whole shire. Entire villages were destroyed, and soon famine and disease stalked in William's wake. He spent the Christmas of 1069 in the city and began the reconstruction of its Norman garrison by building a large timber fortification at the base of his original mound at Clifford's Tower. A moat was created around this structure by the damming of the River Foss, creating a great lake to the east of the city. Around 1080, work started on a new Norman minster. It was completed by 1100. Trade and commerce returned, and the city expanded, and other religious structures were built. Founded in 1088, St. Mary's Abbey was once the richest Benedictine abbey in the north. The original Norman abbey was destroyed by fire, the existing building dating from its rebuilding, which commenced between 1271 and 1294. The abbey's one-time guest house, the Hospitum, still stands in the grounds near to the river, its ground floor dating from 1310 and the upper from 1420. The abbey was dissolved in 1539 and partly demolished to provide building stone for many local buildings. Less than 100 yards from St. Mary's stands the ruin of St. Leonard's. These remains are the surviving corner of what was once the infirmary of the largest hospital in northern England. Erected in the time of King Stephen, it housed over 150 workers and 300 patients, and was a rich, charitable institution, one that could afford to distribute alms from its gate, and every Sunday provided a dinner for prisoners held in York Castle. Just off Stonegate, down one of York's many snickle ways, are the remains of a 12th century Norman house. Its two remaining walls surround a small courtyard and show the existence of a two-story building. Evidence suggests that the building was constructed around 1180, making it the city's oldest remaining dwelling. After having destroyed it, the Normans rebuilt York and assured its future eminence.
York grew in importance until, by the start of the 12th century, it had become the second most important city in the kingdom. William's original wooden castle was enlarged by Henry II, but during a great storm in 1228, the wooden tower and main gate were shattered and the castle deteriorated. A threat of war with Scotland in 1244 necessitated Henry III to refurbish the castle, and Clifford's Tower dates from this period, being completed in 1259. But the danger passed, and over the next 100 years the castle once again fell into disrepair, its foundations becoming unstable due to the floodwaters of the Ouse softening the surrounding land. The familiar name Clifford's Tower was given to the castle keep after a rebellion in 1322, when its leader, one Roger de Clifford, was captured and hung in chains from the castle walls to die. A fate shared in 1537 by Robert Aske, leader of the Pilgrimage of Grace. In the 13th century, the city fathers set about rebuilding the town's defences. The resulting wall follows the line of its Roman predecessor, its stonework constructed on earthen banks originally built by the Danes. Around the city, 4 great entrances, or bars, were built. Micklegate Bar, standing on the road leading southwest, is the city's main entrance. It was on this bar that the severed heads of major criminals and traitors were often displayed. Bootham Bar, standing on the site of the original Roman gate, still retains its 11th century outer arch, some of the oldest surviving masonry in the city walls. The 3 stone figures represent a Lord Mayor, a mason, and a knight. Monk Bar, the city's northern entrance, is also decorated with menacing figures, this time poised to drop stones on the heads of unwelcome visitors. Wormgate Bar, like Bootham, still retains its portcullis, but it is the only bar with its barbican still intact. The wooden house on the inner wall dates from the 16th century. The walls stretch for 3 miles around the city and offer an interesting and wide variety of smaller towers and gates. One of the most unique of these is Red Tower. Unlike the rest of the walls, this tower is constructed of brick. It was severely damaged during the Civil War, but subsequently renovated. Also known as North Street Postern Tower, over the years, Barker Tower has had many different uses. It is named after barkers who used to prepare bark for a nearby tannery. Fishergate Tower is the only remaining one of York's 6 original postern towers. The groove where the portcullis once was can still be seen, as can the projecting lavatory which once discharged into King's Pool, the moat which separated it from Clifford's Tower. Over the centuries, as the town grew, many alterations have been undertaken and new entrances created, allowing both railways and roads to pass through. Victoria Bar was created in 1837 to celebrate the Queen's accession and provided a way from Bishop Hill to Nunnery Lane. However, the Corporation of York must be held responsible for the wholesale destruction wrought on the bars in the early 1800s. This short-sighted corporation promoted the idea of demolishing the city walls, Bootham Bar and Clifford's Tower. However, after a long and heated debate, which saw leading citizens led by the eminent York painter William Etty unite against the corporation, public pressure eventually won, and in 1860 the walls were saved. Unfortunately, it was too late for some small stretches of wall, a number of postern towers, and with the exception of Wormgate, all the barbicans, which had already been destroyed. Religion played an important role in the growth of the city, and by the middle of the 13th century, 40 or so churches and other religious buildings had been erected. Fine Norman doorways and porches can be found in Wormgate, situated on St. Margaret's Church, and on St. Denis, which also contains some of York's oldest glass, dating back to the 12th century. Holy Trinity Church in Micklegate has a 12th century tower and nave. Richard II attended the church, which itself is the remains of a much larger Benedictine priory, founded in 1089 and destroyed by fire in 1137. And in one of York's most fascinating churches, Holy Trinity, Goodramgate, which was constructed between 1250 and 1500 on the site of an earlier 11th century church building. The interior contains a private chapel, which was once blocked off. A squint hole enabled the priest to synchronize his actions with those of the priest holding service at the high altar. The tower of St. Lawrence's Church also features Norman stonework. It is the only remains of a church destroyed during the English Civil War. The lantern tower of All Saints' Church, between Coppergate and High Ousegate, provided a guiding light that led medieval travellers towards the city, although York's tallest church spire, 152 feet high, belongs to St. Mary's in Castlegate, now home to the Castle Museum's York Story. A Dominican priory once existed at Toft Green. A Franciscan priory stood between the castle and the river. Parts of its precinct wall can still be seen at Friars Terrace. A house of Austin Friars existed at Lendal, and a Carmelite house existed at Gillygate. All these orders flourished in the city until the dissolution of the monasteries in 1568.
The official name of the largest Gothic cathedral in Europe is the Cathedral and Metropolitical Church of St. Peter in York. But to residents and tourists alike, it is simply known as the Minster. Throughout York's history, this site has always been of major importance. It once housed the Roman Principia, the military fortress, and in 627 AD was the site chosen by King Edwin of Northumbria on which to build a small wooden church. Around 670 AD, St. Wilfrid rebuilt Edwin's wooden church in stone. This church was destroyed by fire when William the Conqueror laid waste to the north. William ordered the church to be rebuilt and employed Archbishop Thomas of Bayeux to undertake the task. His original building was enlarged by Archbishop Roger Pont l'Evêque between 1154 and 1181. Almost 50 years later, Archbishop Walter de Grey envisaged the creation of a vast cathedral, and in 1227 he began a vast building program that would take 250 years to complete. The north transept was begun in 1241 and completed 20 years later. It houses the famous Five Sisters window, an area of ancient stained glass that covers over 1,330 square feet, the slim lights stretching up for 53 feet. The chapter house, built between 1260 and 1285, is an octagonal building with a conical roof. The structure has no central pillar, the weight and pressures of the roof being supported by the massive external buttresses. The nave was constructed between 1291 and 1360 and is replete with fine medieval stained glass. The eastern end of the minster was completed in 1472 and contains the magnificent Great East Window created between 1405 and 1408 by one John Thornton of Coventry. The window is the size of a tennis court and is the largest single area of medieval glass in the world. The twin west towers were built between 1472 and 1538, and the central tower was completed by 1480, replacing an earlier one that had partially collapsed in 1407. The central boss features images of St. Peter and St. Paul. It is almost 200 feet above the ground and is 4 feet 6 inches wide. Fire has threatened the minster on several occasions. In 1829, John Martin, a religious maniac, started a fire which destroyed much timber work in the choir. This arson attack gave birth to the Minster police force. Today, 11 policemen guard the building day and night, the only church outside the Vatican to have its own police force. In 1840, a workman's candle began a fire which severely damaged the southwest tower and the nave. The minster burnt again in a fire that started in the early hours of the 9th of July, 1984. The flames swept through the roof of the south transept, seriously damaging the rose window. This window, having undergone one of the most challenging works of restoration ever attempted, has now been restored to its original condition. Today, York Minster is one of the finest surviving examples of English Gothic architecture and is the largest Gothic cathedral in Northern Europe, a testament to both the universal faith and to the perceptions and skills of the medieval craftsmen and masons and their successors down the ages.
As York grew and prospered as a port and as a city, its various trades and craftsmen formed themselves into guilds and companies, some powerful enough to build their own guild halls. That of the merchant adventurers still survives. The building, comprising an undercroft, a chapel, and the Great Hall, is the largest timber-framed building in York, and is virtually unchanged since it was built in 1357, when it originally housed a religious institution, the Guild of Our Lord and the Blessed Virgin. Eventually, it became the home of the Merchant Adventurers Company of the city of York, a guild that embraced all aspects of the woolen trade and became one of the most powerful guilds in the city. The Guild Hall of the Merchant Tailors also survives. This guild, an amalgamation of York's drapers, tailors and hosiers, received its royal charter of incorporation from Charles II in 1662. The brick exterior, built in 1672 and 1715, surrounds an original 14th century structure. Originally built in the 15th century for the religious and social guild and fraternity of St. Anthony's Hall in Old York later became an arsenal, a workhouse, a prison, and then a school. Today, it houses the Borthwick Institute of Historical Research and is owned by the University of York. A Lord Mayor, 12 aldermen and 24 councillors presided over the city's government, and in 1446 their existing council chamber on Ouse Bridge was replaced by the present Guildhall. The original 15th century building was gutted during the York air raid on the 29th of April 1942. Restored as an exact replica, it was reopened by Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in 1960. many other medieval buildings and streets still survive. Built in 1316, Lady Row in Goodramgate is York's oldest surviving row of cottages. The buildings are 2 stories high and 1 room deep, and are England's earliest examples of jettied ranges, buildings where the first story overhangs the lower floor. Another 15th century building can be found in Trinity Lane, where a small timbered house has a unique canopied wooden porch, once common in York. Stonegate is York's most elegant medieval street. The Victorian and Georgian facades hide the older medieval structures. Numbers 48 to 58 represent one of York's finest medieval timber-framed ranges. Mulberry Hall, built in the 15th century, replaced an earlier house of the same name. Originally, the street housed booksellers, and in 1500 was the site of the earliest known York Press. A printer's devil can still be seen at the entrance to Coffee Yard. Lawrence Sterne, the author of Tristram Shandy, lodged in the street, and in 1682, number 35 became the site of Francis Hilliard's famous bookshop, The Sign of the Bible. Another fine medieval timber-framed building is the Black Swan at Peasholm Green. Originally, it was built as a house belonging to William Bowes, a rich merchant who twice became Lord Mayor of York in 1417 and 1428. The building eventually became an important coaching inn, and between 1724 and 1726 was home to the parents of General Wolfe. St. William's College is another of York's important medieval buildings. The present half-timbered building was erected between 1465 to 67 and dedicated to William Fitzherbert, Archbishop of York in 1153, great-grandson of William the Conqueror. The building was originally used to house the chantry priests of the Minster, but after the dissolution it became the home of private families. When Charles I moved his court to York, the building was used to house his royal print works, but by the 18th century it had once again reverted to being used as tenements. Today it houses a restaurant and exhibition centre. The Shambles is possibly the most famous medieval street in Britain. Originally it was a street of butchers, its name deriving from flesh shambles or flesh benches, where meat was hung and displayed. The street housed butchers up to the mid-1800s, and numbers 10, 11 and 12 still retain the hooks and meat shelves that gave the street its name. In medieval times, the street would be filled with offal and other garbage, which, coupled with poor sanitation, overcrowding, and an unclean water supply, proved to be the source of the many plagues that haunted York between the 12th and 17th centuries. Today, visitors travel from all over the world to walk down the well-preserved and picturesque narrow street.
The Tudor dynasty came to the throne of England in 1485, when Henry VII strengthened his right to rule by his marriage to Elizabeth of York inside the Minster. Their son, Henry VIII, succeeded to the throne in 1509. When the Pope refused to consent to his divorce from his first wife, Henry broke with Rome, declared himself head of the Church in England, and began to despoil the monasteries and religious houses. During the dissolution of the monasteries, lead was stripped from the roofs, stone removed for building materials, and monastic estates were bought and sold in a land market that enriched the families of the nobility and gentry. Henry's suppression of the monasteries provoked an uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. Robert Aske, the leader of the uprising in Yorkshire, was captured, and 220 of his followers were executed. Aske was captured, chained inside a cage suspended from the wall of Clifford's Tower, and left to die. In 1537, the Council of the North was established to govern the unsettled northerners. It met at King's Manor, the former house of the Abbot of St. Mary's, originally built in 1200 and rebuilt in 1493. Further building work was undertaken in 1560, using stone from the newly dissolved St. Mary's Abbey. It was expanded once again in the 1600s. The house has strong royal connections. Henry VIII is reputed to have stayed there with Anne Boleyn, and later with Catherine Howard. Charles I and Charles II also stayed at the house, as did King James VI of Scotland on his way south to be crowned James I of England. In its time, the house has been a private dwelling, a girls' school, and the home of the Yorkshire School for the Blind. Today, it's part of the University of York. Elizabeth I ascended to the throne in 1558 after the Catholic reaction to her sister Mary's reign. Religious persecution of Catholics soon followed. Between 1582 and 1597, over 40 people were condemned to public execution at York's infamous Tyburn on the Knavesmire, overlooking the racecourse. This site, in 1739, also saw the public execution of Dick Turpin. An eyewitness report stated that
It was remarkable that, as he mounted the ladder, his right leg trembled, on which he stamped it. With an air and undoubted courage, looked around him, and after speaking a few words to the topman, threw himself off the ladder and expired in about 5 minutes.
one of York's most famous Catholic martyrs was Margaret Clitheroe. Born in the Shambles in 1556, Margaret Clitheroe was the daughter of a former mayor of York. When she was 15, she married a local butcher. An upstairs room of their shop was used to hide priests who were smuggled in and out of the city. In 1586, Margaret was caught and sentenced to a horrendous fate of being pressed to death under a heavy wooden door. Margaret Clitheroe was canonized in 1970, and a house in the Shambles is her shrine. A famous son of York is remembered every 5th of November. Guy Fawkes was born in the Stonegate area of the city and baptized in the Church of St. Michael le Belfry in 1570. During this era, York experienced a period of economic decline. The loss of revenue once generated by the great religious houses hit traders hard. The wool and cloth trade was shifting its base to West Yorkshire. The River Ouse was beginning to silt up, and larger ships now unloaded at Hull, discharging their cargoes for an overland journey into Yorkshire. Few alterations were carried out to the city in the 16th century, although Ouse Bridge was entirely rebuilt after the medieval bridge collapsed under the weight of buildings in 1564.
The 17th century York was still in appearances a medieval city. A traveller described the city as mean and cramped in appearance, a reflection of the city's economic decline and population growth, which remained fairly static. But despite its economic problems, York was still a regional capital and an important social centre. Many resident gentry and a proliferation of trades lived within the walls, and by 1662 the city supported almost 60 guilds. Despite there being no programme of major public building, there was some private construction work. Sir Arthur Ingram, a rich Yorkshire financier, built Ingram's Hospital, which can still be seen in Bootham. Christopher Herbert, a rich merchant and Lord Mayor of London, bought a house on this site in 1557, where his great-grandson, Sir Thomas Herbert, gentleman of the bedchamber to Charles I, was born in 1606. The original treasurer's house was built around 1100 and housed the treasurer of York Minster, a position abolished during the dissolution of the monasteries when the house became a private dwelling. The house was rebuilt by Thomas Young between 1628 and 1648, with further improvements being made around 1700. By the 19th century, the house had fallen into disrepair and was divided into three. In 1897, it was purchased by Frank Green, a wealthy Yorkshire industrialist, who began a long restoration process. When he died in the 1930s, he donated the house, together with its antique contents, to the National Trust. But of other buildings built in this period, such as Haberdashers' Hall in Warmgate, no trace now remains. Even the vast mansion of the Dukes of Buckingham, which stood in Skeldergate, have disappeared. The city stagnated, almost as if it and the rest of the country were holding their breath for what was to follow.
The causes of the English Civil War that broke out in 1642 were many. Religious tensions, disputes about parliamentary government, and the crucial question of who controlled the army all converged to create a crisis that was resolved only by war. In spring of that year, Charles I came to York and established his court in King's Manor. To aid the royalist cause, a printing press was set up in St. William's College. And it was in York that the final plans were laid that led to the raising of the King's Standard in Nottingham and the beginnings of the long and bloody struggle. York was the headquarters of the Royalists under their first commander, the Earl of Cumberland, and later under the more effective Earl of Newcastle. Clifford's Tower was used to house a 200-strong Royalist garrison. During the winter of 1644, a large Scottish army invaded England to support the Parliament and marched towards York. The Royalists withdrew behind the city walls, and in April, the siege of York began. On the 16th of June, a group of parliamentarian troops managed to tunnel under Marygate Tower, which at the time was a repository for all records belonging to dissolved Yorkshire monasteries. The tower was blown up, destroying the records and creating a breach in the wall which the parliamentarian forces used to enter the grounds of St. Mary's. The Royalist force saw this attack, marched up Marygate, and in the ensuing battle killed or captured the parliamentarians. Marygate Tower was eventually rebuilt, together with the adjoining wall which had also been destroyed. The siege of York ended in June, when Prince Rupert advanced from Lancashire with a royalist army to relieve the city. The parliamentarian besiegers fled, followed by Prince Rupert and his army, now reinforced by the royalist garrison. The two forces met at Marston Moor, just outside York, on July the 2nd, 1644, in what was the largest and most savage battle of the Civil War. The Royalist army was defeated, largely due to the skill of General Oliver Cromwell and a few mistakes of their own. York surrendered to the parliamentary commander Lord Fairfax on July the 16th, the Royalist garrison marching away with honour, and a parliamentary garrison took their place in Clifford's Tower. In 1684, a fire gutted the interior and the building was abandoned. Yorkshire saw continued fighting, particularly in 1648, but otherwise settled down under parliamentarian rule. But when Cromwell died and the restoration of Charles II seemed likely, the county offered no resistance.
One of the consequences of the Civil War was a developing toleration of those Protestant religious groups that dissented from the established Anglican Church. In 1674, a private house in Friargate became a recognized Quaker meeting house. And in 1692, a chapel was built in St. Saviour Gate for an independent congregation. The restoration of the monarchy in the person of Charles II was in some ways threatened by the Roman Catholicism of Charles's heir, his brother James, Duke of York. Political schemes designed to prevent James ascending the throne led to the Popish plot terror of 1678. The king packed his brother off to safety in Scotland, and on his way, James passed through York. Thomas Thwing, a Catholic priest working in the city, was caught up in the persecutions. He was hung, drawn and quartered at York Tyburn on the Knavesmire in October 1680, the last person to suffer so for his faith. Thwing had been arrested in a house on Castlegate in the company of nuns of the Order of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, founded by Mary Ward. When James ascended the throne in 1685 as James II, those in captivity were freed, and in 1686 the order was given a house outside the city walls in Micklegate. There the order established a convent, and in time a school. In 1699, although it was illegal, the nuns opened a boarding school for
young ladies of Roman Catholic families.
Both convent and the school were rebuilt between 1760 and 1790 by the architect Thomas Atkinson, and still exist in the building to be found today on Blossom Street.
The Georgian era heralded into York a period of gentrification and elegance. The city was still a port, the chief dock being at the King's Staithe, just below Ouse Bridge. Further docks and private jetties were built up and down river. But as the town evolved into a centre of fashionable social life and culture, trade and commerce became less important. Many of York's squalid, medieval, half-timbered houses, shops and streets were replaced with fine new Georgian townhouses, such as Micklegate House and Garforth House. The suburbs expanded, especially fashionable Bootham and the Mount. The Judge's Lodgings was originally a private house built in 1720 for a Dr. Wintringham on the site of St. William's Church. Between 1806 and 1979, when it was converted into an hotel, the building served as lodgings for travelling judges of the assize. Fairfax House has been described as one of the finest 18th century townhouses remaining in Britain. It was originally a much older building, but when Lord Fairfax bought the property in 1760, he employed the York architect John Carr to totally rebuild the interior. The house was fully renovated by the York Civic Trust and was officially opened by the Duchess of Kent in 1984. And today, the building contains a treasure house of Georgian art and furniture, known as the Noel Terry Collection. The first choice for a mansion house was Red House in Duncombe Place. This fine Georgian house was built for Sir William Robinson, Lord Mayor of York and Member of Parliament for York between 1697 and 1722. In 1722, the City Council asked if he would give the house to the city. He refused, and the City Council had to look elsewhere. They eventually chose a site next to the Guildhall. When it was completed, the mansion house was the first of its kind to be built in Britain, London's more famous counterpart being created some 15 years later. Today, it is the official residence of the Lord Mayor of York and houses the city's historic insignia, regalia, and valuable collection of silver plate. The architect was probably another York man, William Etty, who had worked with Vanbrugh at Castle Howard. But the most notable of York architects was John Carr. He was responsible for the creation of the Assize Courts, built between 1773 and 1777, inside the precinct of York Castle. The two courtrooms are still in use today, and over the years have witnessed the trials of Dick Turpin, the Luddites, and the Peterloo rioters. In 1780, John Carr also designed the female prison. Added to the prison to relieve overcrowding, the building was created to complement the Assize Courts opposite. The main prison building was built earlier, between 1701 and 1705. It was described by Daniel Defoe as being
the most stately and complete prison of any in the kingdom.
The increasingly important social functions of the city led to the laying out of formal walks and gardens at Lord Mayor's Walk and New Walk alongside the River Ouse. At the centre of this new fashion were the Assembly Rooms, built by Lord Burlington between 1732 and 1736, and which represent one of Europe's earliest examples of an architectural style called neoclassical. In their heyday, the Assembly Rooms saw great masques and balls, assemblies and routs. Other new attractions were specially created for the amusement of the visiting gentry. In 1744, a theatre was built on the site of St. Leonard's Hospital. Originally known as the New Theatre, it received its royal licence in 1769, when it was said to rival anything in London. Its facade was rebuilt between 1879 and 1880, and a modern extension added in 1967. Georgian York offered a winter season of masques and balls, concerts, and on the Knavesmire, in addition to the spectacle of public executions, horse racing. Horse racing in York dates back to 1530, when an annual race ran through the forest of Gaultiers. And in 1714, the first King's Cup was run on a course at Clifton Ings. In 1731, the racecourse was moved to the Knavesmire, where, around 1754, John Carr established his reputation by building the first racecourse grandstand. There was, however, another side to this elegance. Slums existed in areas such as Wormgate, Fossgate, Gillygate, and Bishop Hill, where unemployment, disease, poverty, and misery was an everyday experience for over half of the city's residents. Yearly epidemics of smallpox, measles, dysentery, and influenza swept the poverty-stricken neighborhoods, spread by poor sanitation and the filth in the streets. An Act of Parliament ordered householders to erect piping to carry water from their roofs. Extensive street paving was undertaken, a city paver being appointed. Healthcare began to improve, and in 1746, a new hospital, the York County Hospital, was built, soon followed by a lunatic asylum in Bootham Park. A dispensary was opened in 1778, where a revolutionary new treatment for smallpox was tried, the inoculation of children.
The first half of the 19th century saw a downturn in York's fortunes. Fashion changed and gentry no longer visited the city. The city stagnated, unemployment was high, poverty and disease were rife. Social occasions, routs and assemblies were on the decline, becoming less and less frequent. By the 1830s, even York races were in decline.
No company, bad sport, and no betting,
grumbled one enthusiast as the sport shifted its centre to Doncaster. Many epidemics occurred. the worst being the cholera epidemic of 1832, which resulted in 185 deaths, 1% of the city's population. A special burial ground outside the walls was created for the victims. The fact was that the city was no longer significant alongside expanding industrial towns like Leeds and Bradford. Only its history and institutions singled it out. Nevertheless, improvements continued. Ouse Bridge, the site of York's oldest bridge dating back to pre-Roman times, was entirely rebuilt in the 1820s and widened, as was Skeldergate, forcing Anne Middleton's hospital to be entirely rebuilt. In 1825, work began on the building of a new prison, and the entire area around the prison buildings, including Clifford's Tower, was enclosed by a high wall. There was no public access until parts of the prison were demolished in 1935. The Yorkshire Philosophical Museum was begun in 1827, built on the same site as St. Mary's Abbey. The neoclassical building, set in 10 acres of parks and gardens, was designed by William Wilkins, the architect who created the British Museum. The elegant sweep of St. Leonard's Crescent was built between 1833 and 34, whilst the De Grey Rooms, now the Tourist Information Office, were built by G.T. Andrews in 1841 and 42. 5 years later, the same architect created one of York's finest Victorian buildings. Originally built to house the offices of the Yorkshire Insurance Company, the building stands prominently overlooking St. Helens Square. Halfway through a century, an event occurred which changed the city's fortunes. The success of George Hudson, ex-draper and Lord Mayor of York, whose vision and entrepreneurial skills led to York becoming the centre of a new countrywide rail network. On either side of a private road linking Station Rise with Tanner Row stand two monuments to York's railway heritage. The large building is the headquarters building of the old North Eastern Railway, opened in 1906, and now the headquarters of the British Rail Eastern Region. The smaller, older building is York's first railway terminus, opened in 1841, reached through a specially created arch in the town wall. By 1865, this terminus proved inadequate, especially for through traffic, and a new station was built outside the city walls on the site of a Roman burial ground. When it was opened in 1878, it was claimed to be the largest station in the world, and today the building, designed by Thomas Prosser, is regarded as one of the finest examples of Victorian railway engineering. The increase of traffic to the newly opened station buildings demanded the building of a second bridge, and construction of Lendal Bridge began in 1860, at a point where a ferry had existed for many years. Unfortunately, within a year, the bridge collapsed, killing 5 people. The present structure was designed by the creator of Westminster Bridge, Thomas Page, and completed in 1863. Skeldergate Bridge was opened in 1881, also on the site of an existing ferry crossing. The small building was a toll house, which until 1914 collected a halfpenny fee for the crossing. The York Art Gallery was built in 1879 and is home for a fine collection of paintings that range from a 14th century altarpiece to works of 20th century artists such as Lowry and Paul Nash. Scattered throughout York are other fine examples of Victorian architecture, as well as reminders of the dark Victorian alleys. However, Clifford Street is York's only entire Victorian street. It houses the fire station, the law courts, the police station.
Between the years 1831 and 1881, York's population rose from 26,000 to 50,000. Speculative slum building added to the unsavory and unhealthy reputation of some areas of the city. And in 1901, Rowntree's book, Poverty, A Study of Town Life, exposed York as a city with almost 28% of its population living in poverty. New housing initiatives were provided by Rowntree's, who built the new Earswick estate in 1901, and by the City Council, who in the 1930s developed housing estates at Tang Hall and Acombe. The 1900s heralded new entertainments, and in 1911 the first York cinema was built in Fossgate. The National Railway Museum dates back to 1927, when the London and North Eastern Railway opened Britain's first railway museum in Queen Street. After nationalisation, a museum of transport opened at Clapham and took over the running of the York Museum. However, British Railways did not want to run museums, and so responsibility passed on to the Science Museum, who planned the opening of a National Railway Museum. After great debate, it was agreed to locate this museum in York, and in 1975, the new National Railway Museum opened to a waiting public. In 1934, York Prison closed, and York Council purchased the entire site. The outer wall was demolished, revealing Clifford's Tower to the public for the first time in 100 years. The building known as the Female Prison was used to house the collection of Dr. John Kirk and was opened to the public in 1938, since when the Castle Museum has become one of the most famous museums in Britain. Many public and private buildings were damaged in the Second World War during the York Blitz. On April the 29th, 1942, the Germans launched a severe air attack on York in reprisal for the bombing of historic Lübeck and Rostock. As well as destroying the Guildhall, bombs also severely damaged the railway station and also destroyed the church of St. Mary le Grand. Now restored, the building has been converted into a paved garden of remembrance to the fallen of 2 world wars. The 1960s brought new architectural styles to the city, with the modernist university campus situated outside York at Heslington. The campus first opened to students in 1963 and features some outstanding examples of modern architecture. However, the oldest building on the campus is Heslington Hall, an Elizabethan mansion built in 1568. During the post-war years, many new buildings and developments have been constructed inside the walled city. Most of them successfully merge into their historic surroundings. Others, such as Stonebow House, arguably York's most reviled modern building, stand out as grave planning errors and serve their purpose to remind the town planners of the future, not to make the same mistakes again. King George VI stated,
"The history of York is the history of England."
Today, York is a modern, vibrant, living city. Buskers and street entertainers liven its daytime pavements, whilst visitors flock to its many shops and attractions. It is also a thriving commercial, musical, and artistic centre, not just a living museum to be visited by tourists. It is populated by families and people who live and work in the city, and who, like their forebears, call York their home, following in the footsteps of peoples of many races, who, through the ages, have all helped to shape the story of the city of York.